The classroom clock struck 8:45 p.m. when Emily Harper gathered her papers and locked the door. Her students had left minutes earlier, leaving the hallways silent. She walked across the dimly lit parking lot, carrying a small leather bag with her lesson plans. The sound of gravel shifted under her shoes as she approached her silver sedan. She placed the bag on the passenger seat, adjusted her coat, and started the engine. The headlights cut through the empty lot, casting long beams toward the main road. Witnesses would later confirm this was the last time anyone saw her alive. Emily drove west, leaving the community college behind. The route was familiar, a straight stretch past fields and barns before it curved toward Dawson County's smaller back roads. The evening was clear, the air sharp with late autumn cold. By 9:05 p.m., her car was no longer on the main road. At 9:27 p.m., a farmer driving home from a late shift spotted something unusual on a gravel path near Route 83. A car sat with its headlights still burning. The driver's door was slightly open, swinging with the wind. The farmer slowed down, expecting to see someone nearby, but the road was empty. Inside the vehicle, the scene was unsettling. Emily's leather bag was still on the passenger seat. Her coat lay folded beside it. The keys were gone. There were no footprints leading away, no broken glass, no signs of a struggle. The coffee cup she carried from the teacher's lounge sat in the console, still half full. The farmer hesitated, then called the Dawson County Sheriff's Office. Dispatch logged the report at 9:34 p.m. Within 15 minutes, 2 deputies arrived. Their flashlights scanned the area, tracing the outline of the road, the ditches, and the fields stretching beyond. Everything appeared undisturbed except for the silent car with its headlights pointed into the dark. They secured the vehicle and searched the immediate area. The ground was firm from cold weather, making footprints difficult to trace. No one was nearby. No vehicle tracks suggested another car had been parked alongside hers. Yet the absence of detail only deepened the unease. By 10:15 p.m., Emily Harper was officially listed as missing. Deputies contacted the college, confirming that she had left her evening class as scheduled. Calls to her parents' home went unanswered at first, but by 10:40 p.m., her father confirmed she had not arrived as expected. The car was towed to the sheriff's lot for further examination. Investigators collected her bag, coat, and coffee cup. Fingerprint dusting began immediately, though nothing unusual appeared at first glance. The absence of her keys was noted in the first incident report. The timeline raised troubling questions. The drive from the college to the gravel path should have taken less than 15 minutes. Yet no one had seen her after she left the parking lot. No neighbors reported unusual noises. No witnesses came forward from nearby farms. Sheriff deputies widened their search, walking the ditches with flashlights and marking the edges with tape. Dogs were called to the scene, but struggled against the cold wind that carried faint scents away. The fields were vast, offering countless places where someone could vanish without leaving a trace. The community college security confirmed that the parking lot cameras were not operational that week due to maintenance. There was no video record of Emily leaving. The only physical certainty was her car, left behind with small details that raised more suspicion than clarity. By midnight, the case had moved from routine welfare check to active disappearance. Officers canvassed the area, knocking on farmhouse doors. They asked about unfamiliar vehicles, strangers on the road, or late-night disturbances. Most residents had seen nothing unusual. At 1:20 a.m., investigators revisited the vehicle. The driver's seat was adjusted forward, consistent with Emily's height. Nothing appeared stolen. Her wallet remained in her bag, untouched. The purse strap was neatly folded. There were no scratches on the door, no broken locks, no shattered windows. Everything suggested she had stopped the car willingly, or been forced to do so in a way that left no struggle behind. The chilling detail lingered, the headlights left on, the engine off, the door ajar. It was as if the car had been abandoned mid-moment, frozen in time. By dawn on November 13, 1998, the quiet gravel road had become the center of an expanding investigation. Patrol cars lined the shoulders. Investigators walked the fields in formation, sweeping their lights across the frost-covered ground. But nothing emerged. No footprints, no discarded objects, no trace of Emily Harper. The sheriff's office marked the vehicle as the last confirmed link in her timeline. Beyond that moment, Emily simply disappeared. What remained was a car with headlights fading against the night, a door left open to the wind, and questions no one could yet answer. And as investigators prepared for the next steps, the search for Emily Harper was only beginning. Emily Harper was 27 years old when she vanished. She had lived her entire life in Dawson County, Nebraska, a place where most people knew one another by name. She worked as a schoolteacher at the local elementary school, teaching second grade. Her colleagues described her as patient and organized, someone who found calm in routine. Emily was the eldest of 2 children. Her parents still lived in the same modest house on the edge of town, while her younger brother served in the military. Family gatherings were small but steady, rooted in traditions that rarely changed. Friends noted that Emily valued stability, preferring quiet evenings and predictable schedules over anything spontaneous. Outside of work, she spent much of her time preparing lessons, reading novels, and helping with community activities. She volunteered for the annual fair, supervised school plays, and often stayed late at the college finishing coursework for her graduate program. To many, she appeared dedicated, reliable, and careful. She had dated briefly in the past, including a relationship that ended months before her disappearance. Those close to her remembered she wanted to move on, focusing instead on her career. She was not known for reckless choices. Her life followed clear patterns, and that made her sudden disappearance even harder to explain. Her colleagues were the first to emphasize how unusual it was for her to miss commitments. Emily never skipped class without notice, never left work unfinished. The certainty of her habits would soon shape the urgency of the investigation. For her students, Emily was more than a teacher. She was the steady adult who guided them through routines, corrected mistakes with patience, and encouraged effort over results. Parents spoke about how she always seemed to notice the small details: a missing lunch, a child who looked worried, a student struggling with homework. Her absence left a visible gap in the community almost immediately when the sheriff's office began piecing together her profile. They found little to suggest a risky lifestyle. She lived alone in a small rented apartment, kept a consistent schedule, and drove the same routes each day. The portrait was of someone grounded and responsible, a young woman whose life gave no hint of sudden danger. It was this ordinary steadiness that made the abandoned car so chilling. Emily Harper was not someone who disappeared without explanation, and as investigators considered her background, the contradictions between who she was and what had happened only deepened the mystery. The night of November 12, 1998, unfolded like so many others for Emily Harper. After finishing her evening class at the community college, she packed her bag and walked into the dark parking lot. Witnesses saw her unlock her silver sedan, place her papers on the seat, and drive away just before 9. There was nothing unusual, nothing that suggested danger. The short route toward her apartment should have taken less than 15 minutes. Instead, her car was discovered at 9:27 p.m., abandoned on a gravel road miles from her usual path. The headlights were still glowing, cutting through the cold air. The driver's side door hung open, swinging slightly. The interior appeared orderly, her belongings left behind. Deputies examined the vehicle carefully. Her leather teaching bag remained on the passenger seat. Inside were notebooks, lesson plans, and her wallet with cash untouched. A folded coat lay on top. The coffee cup in the console was still warm to the touch. There was no sign of theft. There was no sign of struggle inside the car. The absence of keys raised questions. Investigators noted that the ignition was off, yet the headlights had been left on. Whoever had been driving had chosen to end the trip abruptly. The position of the driver's seat matched Emily's height, suggesting no one else had driven. Searchers looked for signs that Emily had walked away on her own. The gravel road stretched between open fields, leading into wooded patches and farm access paths. Yet no tracks were visible in the hardened soil. The ditches on either side were empty. Dogs brought to the scene caught only faint traces that vanished quickly in the night air. The timeline became critical. A student had last seen Emily leaving class at 8:45. By 9:27, her car was already standing alone on the gravel road. The narrow window suggested a sudden detour or interruption. Investigators asked why she would leave her route home for a road she rarely used. Neighbors within a mile radius were interviewed. No one had heard shouting or engines racing. A single farmhouse light was visible from the road, but its occupants reported nothing unusual. The silence surrounding the car's location deepened the sense of mystery. Investigators considered whether Emily had stopped voluntarily. The open door suggested she may have stepped out. But the car's placement on the road, slightly angled toward the ditch, hinted at haste. It did not appear parked with care. It looked as if she had pulled over quickly or had been forced to stop. The items left inside created more confusion. Women in danger rarely abandoned personal belongings without resistance. The intact purse, untouched cash, and carefully placed coat contradicted the idea of robbery. The lack of disruption suggested control. Either she was compelled to leave quietly or left under duress with no chance to react. By 10:15 p.m., the sheriff's office treated the case as an abduction. They expanded their search radius, using flashlights to sweep along fence lines, fields, and barns. Patrol cars circled the back roads, looking for other vehicles. The night remained empty. As midnight approached, the investigation shifted toward reconstructing Emily's last moments. Deputies confirmed her class had ended as usual. Students recalled nothing suspicious in the parking lot. No strangers were reported around the campus. The lack of security footage meant there was no visual record of her departure. Detectives reviewed the items again, searching for details they might have missed. The coffee cup had no visible fingerprints beyond Emily's. Her bag showed no torn straps, no forced zippers. Even the driver's seatbelt hung neatly at her side, as if she had unbuckled without alarm. The image it painted was unsettling, everything in order except Emily herself. The case escalated quickly in the hours that followed. A missing person bulletin went out before dawn. Radio alerts were sent to nearby counties, instructing patrol officers to watch for Emily or her car keys if discarded. But nothing surfaced. By morning, news of the disappearance reached the community. Teachers, parents, and neighbors gathered, asking questions investigators could not answer. How did a young woman vanish within a 15-minute drive from her workplace to her home? Why would she stop on a road she rarely traveled? And what had happened in the brief span between 8:45 and 9:27? The discovery of the car set the tone for everything that came after. It was the single piece of evidence marking Emily's last known location. A vehicle frozen in place, headlights fading, belongings untouched, and no trace of the person who had driven it there. The image was stark. A car on an empty road, a door left open to the cold night, and a silence that would grow heavier with every passing hour. The search for Emily Harper was no longer about late arrival or missed calls. It had become a crime scene, and as investigators marked off the gravel path with tape, they knew the coming days would test every resource they had. The first hours after Emily Harper's disappearance set the foundation for the entire case. By dawn on November 13, 1998, the Dawson County Sheriff's Office had transformed a quiet gravel road into a controlled search site. Patrol cars lined the shoulders, deputies marked the ground with evidence flags, and volunteers gathered at the edge, waiting for instruction. Investigators began by processing Emily's car in detail. They photographed every angle, measured its distance from the ditch, and logged the position of her belongings. The bag on the passenger seat contained notebooks and her wallet, untouched. The folded coat suggested no rush when she placed it there. Yet the open driver's door stood in sharp contrast, a symbol of interruption. Forensics officers dusted the door handles and steering wheel for prints. Partial smudges appeared, but most matched Emily's. One unidentified partial print was noted, but too unclear to confirm. Soil samples were taken from the tires, hoping to confirm where the car had last driven. Nothing suggested it had traveled anywhere unusual before stopping on the gravel path. Detectives widened their focus to Emily's last confirmed location. At the community college, they interviewed staff and students from her evening class. Several remembered seeing her collect her papers at 8:45 p.m., smiling briefly before leaving the building. One student saw her walk toward her car. No one reported another person following her. The college parking lot offered little else. Security cameras out of service due to maintenance had captured nothing. Maintenance records confirmed the outage, frustrating investigators who realized those missing images could have been the key to her timeline. Attention shifted to her personal life. Deputies visited her apartment, finding it tidy with no sign she had returned that night. Her answering machine contained no unusual messages. Friends described her as responsible, with no reason to disappear voluntarily. The lack of warning signs made the disappearance even more alarming. By midday, investigators began examining potential suspects. Emily's recent breakup with Mark Jensen, a farm equipment salesman, quickly drew attention. Mark had a reputation for temper and had argued with Emily weeks before. Detectives brought him in for questioning. He denied involvement, insisting he had been at home that night. His alibi was supported by a neighbor, but suspicion lingered. Other leads emerged through community tips. A truck driver claimed to have seen a silver sedan pulled over on Route 83 around 9 p.m., but he could not identify the driver. Another caller reported a man standing near a parked vehicle in the same area, though details were vague. Investigators logged each report, but none provided solid evidence. The sheriff's office organized large-scale searches of the surrounding fields. Dozens of volunteers joined deputies, walking in lines across frost-covered ground. Helicopters scanned from above, using infrared cameras to detect heat sources. Nothing was found. The vast landscape offered too many hiding places, and the cold weather erased faint traces. Emily's family arrived at the sheriff's office that afternoon. Her parents sat quietly as detectives explained the timeline. Her younger brother, on leave from the military, offered to join search teams. Investigators noted their composure, but also their disbelief. For a family accustomed to Emily's reliability, her absence was unthinkable. Detectives returned to the car again that evening. They studied the position of the seatbelt, the placement of the coffee cup, and the way the door hung open. Every detail suggested Emily had stopped suddenly, yet no one could explain why she would pull onto a road she rarely used. The question became central. Was she lured there, or was she forced? Phone records were requested, though in 1998 they provided limited information. Emily had not made any calls that evening. Banking records showed no unusual activity. Her life, at least on paper, stopped the moment she left the college. Rumors began spreading through the small community. Some whispered about strangers seen near the highway in recent weeks. Others speculated about someone Emily might have known, someone she trusted enough to pull over for. Detectives had to separate fact from speculation, logging each rumor but relying on evidence. By the second night, the case already carried the weight of urgency. Media coverage grew, with local stations reporting a young teacher missing under mysterious circumstances. Posters with Emily's photograph were distributed across Dawson County. Vigil groups formed, lighting candles outside the school where she had taught. Despite the growing attention, the investigation had few solid leads. The abandoned car remained the strongest piece of evidence. Forensics teams processed fibers from the seat, traces of hair and fragments from the floor mat. Most results pointed back to Emily herself. Nothing conclusive identified another presence in the car. Detectives considered the possibility of a targeted attack. Emily's predictable schedule made her vulnerable. She drove the same route at the same time every week. If someone had planned to intercept her, the opportunity was clear. Yet investigators had no clear suspect capable of such planning. By the end of the first week, frustration was mounting. Search teams had combed miles of fields and ditches. Interviews had ruled out co-workers and neighbors. Theories piled up, but evidence was scarce. The case, though only days old, already showed signs of the silence that often surrounds disappearances. The early investigation left investigators with two undeniable facts. Emily Harper was missing, and her car was left behind in a way that defied explanation. Everything else was possibility, theory, and unanswered questions. And as the first week ended, detectives knew they were running out of time. The longer Emily remained missing, the slimmer the chances of finding her alive. The disappearance of Emily Harper rippled quickly through Dawson County. By the morning after her car was found, word had spread across schools, churches, and farms. In a small town where few secrets ever lasted, the absence of a well-known teacher was impossible to ignore. At the elementary school, Her empty classroom was the first sign that something was deeply wrong. Colleagues replaced her name on the schedule board with a note that simply read, "Coverage needed." Children whispered in hallways, asking where Miss Harper had gone. Parents stood outside the school doors uneasy, realizing the story was no longer rumor, but confirmed by deputies. That evening, neighbors organized a vigil near the courthouse square. Dozens of candles lined the steps, flickering against the cold. Flyers with Emily's photograph were handed out, each one showing the same portrait of her smiling in a classroom. No one gave speeches. The silence spoke louder than words. Her parents arrived but remained quiet. Her father stood at the back watching the crowd, while her mother kept her gaze fixed on the ground. They did not plead publicly. They did not dramatize their pain. Their presence alone carried the weight of what had been lost. Her brother, recently returned from the military, joined search groups that combed fields and ditches. He walked in silence, focused, refusing interviews with reporters. For him, action mattered more than words. Local media covered the case relentlessly. News anchors repeated the timeline, displaying images of the gravel road where the car had been left. Viewers called in with tips, though most led nowhere. Still, the coverage kept the case alive in every household. In small towns, fear spreads quickly. Residents began locking doors they once left open. Parents drove their children to school instead of letting them walk. Conversations at diners and gas stations circled the same unsettling point. If Emily could vanish without warning, so could anyone. The community's grief never tipped into hysteria. It was a restrained kind of shock, visible in lowered voices. In the careful way neighbors asked one another if there was news, in the sight of candles burning outside church steps long after the vigils ended. The collective silence pressed heavily on investigators. The town waited, but answers did not come, and as the days turned into weeks, that silence would open the door to rumors, false leads, and frustration. In the weeks after Emily Harper's disappearance, investigators chased every lead that came their way. Each tip carried the hope of a breakthrough, but one by one they fell apart. The first major lead involved a reported sighting along Highway 30. A motorist claimed to have seen a young woman matching Emily's description walking near the shoulder late at night. Deputies canvassed the area and reviewed traffic stops from that evening. Nothing matched. No footprints, no abandoned belongings, no second witness. The report was eventually dismissed as mistaken identity. Another lead came from a truck driver, who insisted he had seen a man struggling with a woman near a silver sedan close to Route 83. His description of the man was vague: tall, wearing a cap, no defining features. Detectives followed up, interviewing workers at nearby truck stops. Several drivers wore similar caps. None could be connected to Emily. The lead produced hours of interviews, but no results. Attention soon turned again to Mark Jensen, Emily's former boyfriend. Rumors spread quickly that he had been seen near her apartment days before she disappeared. Detectives questioned him again, pressing harder about his movements. He maintained. His alibi and his neighbor confirmed his presence at home during the critical hours. Without physical evidence, investigators had no grounds to hold him. Anonymous calls flooded the sheriff's office. Some claimed Emily had been taken by a stranger passing through town. Others suggested she had left voluntarily, running from responsibilities no one else knew about. Investigators tested each theory against the facts. Her car, her belongings, her family's testimony. None aligned. Emily's life had shown no sign of escape or secret planning. A farmer reported seeing fresh tire marks near one of his fields the morning after her disappearance. Deputies inspected the site, measuring the impressions. They found the tracks belonged to a tractor, used the previous evening, not a vehicle linked to the crime. What first appeared promising dissolved into routine farm activity. Weeks later, hunters discovered fabric snagged on a barbed wire fence, miles from where her car had been found. Forensic testing showed it belonged to an old work shirt, not Emily's clothing. The discovery raised hope briefly, only to end in disappointment. The lack of progress weighed on the investigative team. Every false lead consumed hours. Every dead end drained morale. Detectives revisited the evidence repeatedly, studying photographs of the car, examining Emily's timeline, rereading witness statements. Each time, they arrived at the same place. No clear suspect, no clear path forward. The community began to lose confidence. Some accused law enforcement of focusing too narrowly on certain suspects. Others claimed deputies were overwhelmed by the case's complexity. Pressure mounted, but without new evidence, the investigation stalled. By late December 1998, 6 weeks after her disappearance, the trail was already fading. Tips slowed, searches grew smaller, and hope began to shift toward recovery rather than rescue. The case, once urgent, settled into a pattern of unanswered questions. Each dead end left behind a sense of wasted time, but together they marked the slow unraveling of momentum. The initial surge of community energy gave way to fatigue. Investigators had worked every direction, only to circle back to the same mystery: a car on a gravel road and a woman gone without trace. It was a cycle that would repeat in the months and years to come. Every promising detail seemed destined to collapse. Every new report carried the weight of inevitable disappointment, and as the new year began, Emily Harper's case was already on the verge of growing cold. By the spring of 1999, the case of Emily Harper had slowed to a crawl. The initial flood of tips had dried up. Leads that once looked promising were proven false. What remained was silence. Detectives continued to review the file, hoping for overlooked details. They studied photographs of her abandoned car, re-examined notes from witness interviews, and walked the gravel road again and again. Nothing new surfaced. Every angle seemed exhausted. Emily's family held on to routine. Her parents organized small vigils on the anniversaries of her disappearance, but attendance grew smaller with each passing year. Her brother returned to his military service, carrying quiet frustration that no answers had come. The family rarely spoke to the media, preferring silence to speculation. Within the sheriff's office, the case file thickened but produced no progress. Detectives were reassigned to newer investigations. Resources shifted. The disappearance of a young teacher remained on record, but without evidence or suspects, it could not move forward. The file was marked cold before the year ended. In Dawson County, the story became a shadow. Residents remembered Emily in passing conversations, usually when driving the road where her car had been found. Some avoided the stretch altogether, calling it cursed. Others used it daily, a reminder of how quickly life could change. The community carried the memory, but slowly the urgency faded. By the early 2000s, Emily's case appeared only in occasional newspaper articles. Each report repeated the same facts: a missing woman, an abandoned car, no resolution. Detectives offered the same response to reporters. The investigation remained open, but no new evidence had emerged. Time worked against the search for answers. Witness memories blurred, potential evidence degraded. Leads that might have mattered in the first days lost their clarity with every year that passed. Technology of the late 1990s could not provide the forensic breakthroughs that would later become possible. For Emily's family, the silence was its own kind of punishment. They had no grave to visit, no final confirmation of what had happened. They lived with questions that never softened, only grew sharper in absence of truth. For investigators, the case remained a reminder of limits. Despite hours of searching, interviewing, and testing, a single missing piece kept the puzzle unsolved. The car on the gravel road still stood as the only physical marker of the crime. Beyond that, the trail vanished. As years stretched into decades, the disappearance of Emily Harper was remembered only as one of Nebraska's many unsolved cases. It seemed destined to remain that way, a story frozen in 1998. But more than 20 years later, technology would give investigators a reason to reopen the file. And what had once been silence was about to shift into revelation. For more than 20 years, the case file of Emily Harper sat in the Dawson County evidence room. Thick folders of reports, photographs, and failed leads rested in storage boxes labeled with her name. Detectives came and went. Each one glanced at the file, hoping to see what had been missed. Each one moved on without answers. Then, in 2020, Nebraska launched a statewide initiative to re-examine unsolved cases using modern forensic tools. Cold case units began pulling files from storage, reviewing evidence once thought too limited to matter. Among them was the disappearance of Emily Harper. Detective Laura McKenna, newly assigned to the task force, opened the worn folder. She read the incident reports, studied the photographs of the abandoned car, and traced the timelines investigators had built decades earlier. What caught her attention was not what had been discovered, but what had been overlooked. Inside an evidence bag were swabs collected from Emily's car door handle and gear shift. In 1998, testing produced nothing conclusive. By 2020, technology had changed. McKenna requested new analysis. The samples were sent to the state crime lab, where advanced DNA profiling could extract results from even the smallest trace. Weeks later, the lab contacted her with news that would reshape the case. A partial profile had been recovered. The DNA was entered into CODIS, the national database. For days there was silence. Then the system produced a hit. The partial matched a profile already on record. The name attached to that profile was Thomas Reed. Reed was 55 years old, a mechanic living in a small town less than 2 hours from Dawson County. His record included burglary, assault, and a conviction for unlawful entry in the early 1990s. He had served time, but had never been connected to violent crimes beyond those incidents. His name had not appeared in the original investigation file. McKenna studied his history carefully. In 1998, Reed had been working contract jobs across Nebraska, repairing farm equipment. Records showed he had been in Dawson County around the time of Emily's disappearance. He was never interviewed. His movements had gone unnoticed by investigators at the time. The breakthrough was electric. After 2 decades of silence, the case finally had a suspect tied to physical evidence. Yet DNA alone would not be enough. McKenna needed more to connect Reed directly to Emily Harper. She dug deeper, pulling his employment records, examining his known addresses and mapping his travel patterns. She learned that in late 1998, Reed had been living in a rented trailer near a series of back roads that intersected with Route Pine TC 83. The gravel road where Emily's car was discovered was only a short drive from his worksite. The pieces began to align. Reed's background revealed a history of anger and control issues. Former employers described him as volatile. A former girlfriend spoke of his possessive behavior and sudden rages. Small details from his past began to echo in the mystery of Emily's disappearance. The crime lab results were verified twice. Each test confirmed the same conclusion. Reed's DNA was on Emily's car. The profile was not strong enough to say when it was left there, but its presence could not be ignored. Detective McKenna felt the weight of the moment. For 22 years, the Harper family had waited for answers. Now a name existed. A man who had walked free, living his life in plain sight, had left his trace on the evidence that held the key to Emily's fate. Investigators prepared a full review for the district attorney. The report laid out the original disappearance, the discovery of the abandoned car, the lack of resolution, and now the forensic link to Thomas Reed. The family was contacted quietly. Emily's parents listened as detectives explained the DNA findings. They did not speak much, but their silence carried decades of restrained grief. For the first time since 1998, they were told there was a person connected to their daughter's disappearance. The breakthrough also reignited media interest. Local newspapers reported that Emily's case was being reviewed with new technology. They did not publish Reed's name, but speculation grew quickly. For the community, the news was a shock. The disappearance once thought unsolvable was suddenly alive again. Detective McKenna pressed forward. She knew DNA alone would not close the case. To move toward an arrest, she needed corroborating evidence. Old witness statements were re-examined. Maps of Reed's work routes were compared with Emily's timeline. Former acquaintances were interviewed about his behavior in the late 1990s. Slowly, the picture of a man who might have crossed paths with Emily Harper began to form. The task force prepared surveillance on Reed. They monitored his routines, documented his contacts, and collected fresh DNA to confirm the match. Every step tightened the circle around him. For more than 2 decades, the trail of Emily Harper had been silent. Now science had forced the case open. A single trace of DNA, invisible in 1998, had survived long enough to reveal a name, and that name would lead investigators directly to the man who had hidden in plain sight for 22 years. Detective Laura McKenna carried Emily Harper's file with her everywhere. The thick folder rarely left her desk, and on late nights it remained open beside a lamp. Pages spread like fragments of a puzzle she was determined to solve. The DNA hit to Thomas Reed had given the case new life, but it was not enough for a prosecution. McKenna knew she needed a stronger chain of evidence. For months, she retraced steps from 1998, examining how Reed's path might have intersected with Emily's final night. She drove the same route Emily had taken from the community college. She stopped at the gravel road where her car was discovered, walking the length of the shoulder, picturing how the headlights must have cut through the dark, how the door had stood open in the silence of the fields. She imagined Reed's vehicle pulling alongside hers, the brief window where everything changed. Her obsession grew methodical. Every small lead was tracked. Old witnesses were located. One recalled seeing a truck parked on a dirt road that evening, though at the time it seemed unimportant. McKenna checked Reed's vehicle history. Records showed he owned a similar model in 1998. She studied Reed's employment logs. He had taken short-term mechanic jobs in Dawson County that autumn, often traveling the back roads after work. Maps of his known locations overlapped with Emily's routine. McKenna requested surveillance on Reed, now in his 50s. Investigators observed him carefully, noting his movements, his temper, and his isolation. Neighbors described him as quiet but sometimes erratic, a man who kept to himself and avoided long conversations. He had no close friends and no steady family connections. The task force obtained a warrant for his discarded items. DNA collected from a coffee cup matched the profile on Emily's car, strengthening the forensic link. The chain grew tighter. Still, McKenna felt the weight of caution. A case built on partial DNA and circumstantial patterns had to be airtight. She spent hours reconstructing the timeline of Emily's final night, charting her departure from class, her expected arrival home, and the estimated window of disappearance. She overlaid Reed's possible movements, narrowing down how he could have crossed her path. Every detail mattered. A fuel receipt placed him in Dawson County within the same week. A co-worker recalled him missing a morning shift around the time Emily vanished. Each fragment added to the mosaic McKenna was building. Her determination sometimes unsettled colleagues. They noted how often she spoke of Emily Harper, as if she had known her personally. But McKenna viewed the case as unfinished work, a story with an ending still waiting to be written. She contacted Emily's family regularly, keeping them informed, promising only facts, never assumptions. The Harpers listened quietly, their hope cautious but real. After years of silence, they now had someone unwilling to let the case fade. McKenna's persistence drove the investigation into sharper focus. What once looked like scattered coincidences began to align into a narrative. Reed's presence in Dawson County, his violent background, his proximity to Emily's route, and his DNA on her vehicle. The case that had been cold for more than 2 decades was warming rapidly. Detectives knew it was only a matter of time before Reed would be confronted directly, and when that moment came, they would discover how much he had carried in silence since the autumn of 1998. On a cold February morning in 2021, Thomas Reed's name moved from quiet surveillance reports to the center of a full-scale operation. Detectives had built their case, each detail reinforcing the suspicion that he was the man who had taken Emily Harper on that October night in 1998. The time had come to confront him. At 6 a.m., officers arrived at Reed's small rental home. His driveway was empty except for an aging truck, rust streaking the doors. The lights were off. When investigators knocked, Reed answered in worn clothes, confusion on his face. The warrant was read aloud. His property would be searched, his DNA officially collected, and he would be questioned about the disappearance of Emily Harper. Inside the home, the atmosphere was stark. Detectives noted tools spread across the kitchen table, a stack of old mechanic manuals, and little evidence of personal connections. Reed stood silent as officers moved carefully through the rooms. When asked to accompany them downtown, he did not resist. The interview began in a plain interrogation room at the sheriff's office. Reed sat across from Detective Laura McKenna, his hands folded, his eyes fixed downward. She placed a photograph of Emily Harper on the table. For several minutes there was no reaction. Then Reed shifted in his chair, glancing at the image before turning away. McKenna spoke in measured tones. She explained the evidence, the DNA recovered from Emily's car, the corroborating matches that proved his presence at the scene. She laid out his history, his work in Dawson County, and the pattern of his movements on the night Emily vanished. Every piece closed the gap between him and the truth. Reed denied knowing her at first. He insisted he had never met Emily Harper, that he had no reason to remember her name. But the weight of the DNA pressed against him. McKenna repeated the facts, calm but relentless, pointing to the profile that matched his with certainty. Hours passed. Silence became his main response, a wall against the questions. Detectives left him alone with the photograph on the table. When they returned, Reed's expression had changed. The defiance had slipped into something heavier. Finally, his voice broke the silence. He said he had seen her car on the side of the road that night. He admitted he had stopped, claiming at first that it was only to offer help. But his account shifted as detectives pressed further. Reed confessed that an argument had started. He said Emily refused his advances. That anger overtook him in a moment he could not control. His words were flat, stripped of remorse, but they carried the admission investigators had waited more than 20 years to hear. He described forcing her from the vehicle, leading her toward a remote stretch of farmland. The confession outlined violence, panic, and eventual silence. Emily Harper never returned home because Reed had ended her life that night. Detectives listened carefully, documenting each word. The details matched what they suspected, but had never been able to prove. His description of the gravel road, the position of her car, the objects left behind, each one aligned with the crime scene from 1998. When asked where Emily's remains could be found, Reed hesitated. At first he refused to answer. Then, slowly, he provided a location, a wooded area outside Dawson County, near an abandoned shed where he once worked. Search teams were dispatched immediately. Hours later, they uncovered human remains in the location Reed identified. Forensic analysis confirmed what investigators already knew. After 22 years, Emily Harper had finally been found. The confession was chilling not for its detail but for its cold delivery. Reed offered no apology, no sign of grief for the life he had taken. He spoke only in statements, as if recounting an incident long disconnected from his own conscience. Detectives closed the interview with the weight of finality. The silence that had stretched for decades was broken by Reed's own words. The man who had lived freely since 1998 was no longer hidden. News of the confession spread quickly. For the Harper family, it was both relief and devastation. The truth they had waited decades to hear had arrived, but with it came the final confirmation of Emily's fate. For the community, the revelation was a shock. A man who had lived quietly among them was now exposed as the one responsible for an unsolved tragedy that had haunted Dawson County for years. Reed was charged with murder, his confession forming the core of the prosecution's case. The DNA, the timeline, and his own words created a structure that could not be broken. What began with a missing woman, an abandoned car, and unanswered questions had now reached the moment of truth. And the name Thomas Reed would forever be tied to the disappearance of Emily Harper. The day Thomas Reed was arrested, Dawson County woke to headlines no one thought they would ever read. After 22 years of silence, a man had been charged with the disappearance and murder of Emily Harper. The news broke early, spreading from local stations to statewide broadcasts before noon. The arrest was conducted quietly but firmly. Reed was taken from his small rental home in handcuffs, escorted by deputies who had watched him for months. Neighbors stood on their porches, stunned at the scene unfolding on their quiet street. Few had known him well, but most recognized his truck, his presence at local shops, his silent habits. None imagined he carried the weight of a crime that had haunted the community for 2 decades. At the sheriff's office, the booking process was swift. His charges were read: first-degree murder, kidnapping, and unlawful disposal of human remains. His mugshot appeared in every news report by evening. To the public, his face became the answer to a question that had lingered since 1998. Who was responsible for Emily Harper's disappearance? For Emily's family, the arrest brought a mixture of relief and sorrow. Her parents stood before cameras only briefly. They thanked investigators for never letting the case fade and asked for privacy, as they processed the confirmation of what they had always feared. Their words were brief, their expressions marked by years of quiet endurance. The community reacted with shock. At the grocery store, in schools, at church gatherings, conversations turned to Reed's arrest. People asked how he had escaped suspicion for so long, how he had lived nearby while Emily's case grew cold. Some expressed anger that justice had taken more than 2 decades. Others admitted relief that the truth had finally surfaced. Detectives reflected on the long path that led to this moment. For those who had worked the original investigation, the arrest was bittersweet. They remembered long nights in 1998, the endless interviews, the empty roads they searched without success. Now at last, there was resolution, though delayed by years that could never be regained. The district attorney's office prepared the case carefully. They knew the trial would draw statewide attention. The evidence was strong. The DNA recovered from Emily's car, the corroborating match to Reed, his confession, and the recovery of her remains where he said they would be. Still, prosecutors moved methodically, aware of the weight of the charges and the decades of waiting carried by the Harper family. Local newspapers published long retrospectives on the case, recounting the night of Emily's disappearance, the discovery of her car, and the many years of unanswered questions. Photos of her classroom, her smiling portraits from the late 1990s, and images of the gravel road resurfaced in public memory. The community was reminded not just of the crime, but of the life taken. Reed's arrest also reignited discussion of unsolved cases across Nebraska. If DNA technology had solved Emily's case after so many years, families of other missing persons wondered what new answers might be waiting in old evidence boxes. The impact of her case rippled beyond Dawson County, fueling renewed interest in forensic review programs statewide. As Reed sat in custody awaiting trial, his silence continued. He offered no statements beyond his confession. Attorneys prepared his defense, but the strength of the evidence left little room for denial. The man who had avoided justice for decades now faced the full weight of the law. For the Harper family, the arrest marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The grief of losing Emily remained, but at least the questions that had haunted them were answered. They could now mourn with certainty, no longer caught between hope and despair. The community of Dawson County moved forward, forever marked by the case that had defined a generation. The abandoned car on the gravel road was no longer just a symbol of mystery. It was part of a closed circle, a story that had finally reached its conclusion, and in the quiet of Nebraska's fields, the long silence surrounding Emily Harper's disappearance had finally been broken by justice. The story of Emily Harper began with an abandoned car on a gravel road. Headlights glowing in the night, a door left ajar, silence pressing against the fields. For more than 2 decades, that silence defined her case. Detectives searched, the community waited, and her family endured. Time passed, seasons changed, and yet no answers came. Emily's name became part of Dawson County's memory, a reminder of a life interrupted without explanation. It was science that reopened the door. A fragment of DNA overlooked in 1998 held its strength long enough to speak. It connected Emily to Thomas Reed, a man who had hidden in plain sight while carrying the truth of her fate. The confession he finally gave did not bring comfort. It brought confirmation. It proved what had always been feared, but it also delivered the one thing Emily's family had sought for more than 20 years. The truth. Cold cases are stories of waiting, years where evidence sits in boxes, where families hold on to fading hope, where answers exist but remain just out of reach. Emily's case shows how time can bury clues, but also how persistence and technology can one day uncover them. For Dawson County, the resolution was both closure and wound. Justice arrived but late. A generation had grown up with her disappearance unsolved. The community was shaped by her absence before it was shaped by the truth. Emily Harper's life was stolen in 1998, but her story was not lost. Through determination, science, and patience, her voice was finally restored. The final reflection is simple, restrained, and heavy. Silence does not erase the past. It waits, and sometimes after years of waiting, the truth rises to the surface.